Lovely to see you here. And for the English amongst us, happy St George's Day. For the Welsh, the Scots and the Northern Irish, tough. You have your day, we've got ours. It's great to see you all here for this talk about Vietnam. And I'll do a short introduction to Ken in a minute. Not going to make it a long one because you haven't come to hear me. One thing I would like to ask you though, if anybody's keen on cookery, the young professionals from the British Chamber are doing an event on Saturday at Culinaire, which is in Emporium. And it's actually a live cooking opportunity. And if any of you are keen to learn how to make carrot cake, for example, and it won't cost you anything, Tisha's got a few places left, so see her before you leave if you do want to go on that. I appreciate most of you won't, but just in case there is somebody there sitting there thinking, oh, that's lovely, I fancy that. Saturday afternoon, sort of noon onwards. Right, Ken Atkinson, Kenneth as it says up there. Only his mother calls him Kenneth, yes. A bit like me and Christopher. Ken started his career many years ago. I won't tell you how many, but he might not, depending on how he feels. He currently works with Grant Thornton in Vietnam and has done in one guise or another since 1998, I think. Yeah? 93. Oh, right, okay. I'm misreading this then.
No, okay.
All right, well, you can tell me, Ken.
We changed our name to Grant Thornton in '98, so that is actually correct.
So we're both right. Right, I like that. And he's also, at the moment, chairman of the British Business Group in Vietnam, which is a bit like the Chamber, a different sort of name, but same sort of idea, and does the same sort of role in Vietnam as the British Chamber would do here. Now, there's a lot more I could read out. I've taken my glasses off because this is so small I couldn't read it with my glasses on. I can hardly read it with my glasses off. So, can we give a warm welcome, please, to Ken Atkinson?
Okay, good afternoon everybody. The problem with speaking after lunch is I'm as sleepy as you are, so I'll try and make it interesting enough to keep everybody awake. Okay, just why we call the British Business Group Vietnam. We were one of the first two chambers to be licensed in Vietnam in 1998, and at that time they did not allow foreign groups to call themselves chambers. The only authorised Chamber of Commerce was the Vietnam Chamber of Commerce and Industry, so we adopted the name British Business Group Vietnam, and we retained that name, unlike more of the newcomers like the Australian Chamber called AustCham and AmCham, of course, who defied all the rules anyway. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we do as a chamber, and more importantly about the Vietnamese economy and where we see the opportunities and the challenges, and then I'm happy to take as many questions as there are in the time that we have remaining. So I'll run through, as I say, the BBGV, business environment, economy, investment outlook, some of the key trade agreements, and the plug for overseas membership. So the chamber is divided into two parts. We have what we call the chamber or the secretariat, and more importantly these days we have the business centre, which is the OBNI partner, as you are in Thailand, for Department of International Trade. And we have a team of 6 people under our executive director that handle all incoming trade inquiries, investment inquiries, and inward missions. So the full range of services. We do webinars. Peter's just been on a visit to the UK with Greg and the executive directors of several other chambers in the region. We offer overseas membership. That's about 500 plus members. I think we have 16 overseas members, but it does enable you to receive our e-newsletters, keep update with what's going on in Vietnam, can help to build your brands through our communication channels, and also to be able to avail yourself of any specific services that you want to engage us for. I like to start with, I've been in Vietnam for 30 years, I've been in Asia for 42 years, and I always like to go back to when I first arrived in Vietnam in 1989, before I talk about where we're at today. And Doi Moi actually started in 1986, that's Vietnam's open door policy, but the first foreign investment law was not actually passed till December 98, and that lag in where Vietnam wants to be and where it actually is because of the regulatory environment continues until today. The total foreign trade in 1990 was $5 billion US, and the average per capita income in the country was less than $200, and the country had no foreign exchange reserves to really speak of. It was very dependent on barter trade with the then Soviet Union. Today, fast forward, we have growth last year, GDP growth of over 7%, one of the highest in Southeast Asia and ASEAN. It was higher than the target. Normally, the target becomes reality in a communist-controlled environment, as you might well appreciate. We don't miss targets. The CPI has been under control. We did have around 2007, 2008, 9. We had very high inflation, which was major concern to both investors and the government and the local population. That was fairly quickly brought under control, and since that time we've had inflation running well below 4%. Again, I find it strange for a communist country that they do actually publish unemployment rates. They're very, very low. Some people would argue they're very low because of the overemployment in the government sector. Foreign exchange reached a record high last year of 63.5 billion. Still fairly low by global standards, but there is another part to that story. It's reckoned that there is over $60 billion in gold and foreign currency in private hands under the mattress at home. So that gives you also perspective on the situation the government has to deal with when trying to manage the economy. Local lending rates are fairly high, but then deposit rates, you can get 7% on Vietnamese dong deposits at the moment in Vietnam from the local banks, and dollar lending rates are controlled really by the state bank. But it is possible for foreign invested companies and export-oriented companies to borrow foreign currency in Vietnam. So everything right in 2018 and continues to look good for 2019. And in terms of the global competitiveness report, Vietnam ranked 77th out of 140 countries. The government's working hard to try and improve the business environment and the regulatory environment. Unfortunately, there's a system of central government and local government officials don't always want to make it as easy for investors, both domestic and foreign, as the central government would like. So if we look back over the last 10 years, that's the GDP growth trends. Of course, 2009, we were just coming out of the global financial crisis in 2008, and we tend to be more impacted by external factors than we do internal factors. If you went back the 20 years before 2009, or certainly up to 2007, excluding the period of the Asian financial crisis, GDP growth rates actually were between 7 and 8% for that whole period. GDP growth per capita, if you remember, 1990 was below $200, doubled by 2000, and has continued to grow very, very significantly. In the major cities, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, average per capita incomes are around $5,500 to $6,000 US. That's a year. So our total global trade, imports and exports, is almost $500 billion in 2018. I'm going to just flip on to the next one because it's easier to read. So today our biggest exports are mobile phones and spare parts, almost 25% of our total exports, and a big chunk of those are down to Samsung, who's invested over $4 billion US into Vietnam in the last few years. Textile and garments are still a major export, but they were the leading export for many, many years. But you'll also see when we start to look at the imports, a lot of these same industries or sectors are represented on both sides. So there's a lot of materials that are imported into Vietnam for processing. Mobile phones are the same, textiles are the same. But it is starting to change as there's more investment into supply chain related industries and companies. So if we go to the imports, so there we are, electrical products and parts, telephones and spare parts, and textile and fabrics all in the top four. I know there's somebody here from the petroleum industry, so Vietnam used to be a major exporter of heavy crude because we didn't have any refining at all in Vietnam until about 5 years ago. Today there is refining, but they still export quite a bit of the heavy crude, and in return we import real refined products. But we've got 2 more oil refineries under construction at the moment. Foreign direct investment has been a great story for the last few years, and we were up at record levels in 2017, 2018, and also the actual, what I call remitted investment, as opposed to committed investment, has also been running at historically high numbers at around $19 to $20 billion a year. The major investors, Japan and Korea, seem to flip-flop year on year. Singapore, Hong Kong, so it's all, and mainland China now investing directly rather than through Hong Kong and Singapore, but it is very, very regionally focused. Interesting that the 6th largest and the largest non-Asian investor is the British Virgin Islands, and there are obviously reasons for that. Thailand has kind of shot up in the rankings over the last 2 to 3 years with major investments coming out of Thailand into Vietnam. Siam Cement is a big investor. Central Group is growing in leaps and bounds in Vietnam, and several other Thai companies. That Thai Bev, of course, they bought a major stake in one of the state-owned brewing companies last year and paid a phenomenal amount of money. I think it was $4.5 billion, with very little opportunity to do any due diligence at all. The sectors that are attracting that investment, processing and manufacturing is the major one. Because of the China-US tensions at the moment, we're seeing an accelerated movement of manufacturing out of China into Vietnam. It's a process that started several years ago with China Plus One policy by a lot of international companies and multinational companies, but I say it's accelerated now to, in many cases, to out of China completely. Wholesale retail is always significant interest to investors because of the rapidly growing middle class in Vietnam. It's estimated that by 2025, 40% of the population will be in that middle class as opposed to 14% a couple of years ago. With Grant Thornton, we do a private equity survey every year. The results I've actually got this year's to proofread at the moment, but so this is based very much on last year, but we don't find that the main drivers for investment change year by year. So it is that rise of the middle class and disposable income that attracts a lot of investment. Strong, stable economic growth, and in particular stable politically. Vietnam is very stable. Competitive labour costs, compared to China, we're still quite low, but I'll talk about it when I look at some of the challenges. But labour productivity is certainly a key challenge in Vietnam at the moment. Favourite sectors: food and beverage, healthcare, pharmaceutical, education and retail. And I'd say transportation and logistics as well have attracted a lot of attention. Big focus at the moment on renewable energy, in particular solar and wind power. The government has given a range of incentives for solar power and talking about incentives for wind power, particularly on the feed-in tariffs. So that's attracting quite a bit of attention, and the growing energy need in Vietnam. So the most talked about or the issues, the obstacles to investment, particularly from more regulated economies and countries, is the inconsistent, non-transparent policies, regulations, and interpretation of those regulations. So, for example, you can get a ruling from the tax department in Hanoi, which can be totally different from a ruling on the same subject and the same situation than you get from the tax department in Ho Chi Minh City. And this is one of the challenges for investors. Corruption is still a big issue at all levels in Vietnam. And that's really induced by the system. Government officials pay for their jobs, and everybody wants to make a return on their investment, including government officials. So how do you do that when you're earning very low $200, $300 a month salaries? So it's going to be very, very hard to break that. But there are some very, very high profile corruption cases going on in Vietnam at the moment. You may have read about them. Government officials, bankers, sons of well-to-do, successful business people. So. Infrastructure is also a challenge, particularly if you're in manufacturing or logistics, but it's certainly getting better. And as I mentioned, low labour productivity. Last year, interestingly, was the first year that I can remember where productivity actually was higher. The increase in productivity was higher than the increase in the minimum salary or minimum wage. So we may be heading in the right direction. Key deal breakers if you're looking at M&A transactions in Vietnam, or possible M&A transactions. Lack of transparency. Most Vietnamese companies have at least 2 sets of books, and sometimes 3. I did ask one guy what the third set was for. He said, well, that's the one I show my wife, it's got no cash. difference in valuation expectations and legal issues, and as I say, lack of clarity with interpretation of regulations. So, as I say, the government is trying to create a more enabling environment. They want to be known as an enabling government, and they do recognise the importance of foreign investment in Vietnam. About 70% of Vietnam's exports come from foreign invested enterprises at the moment. There is a continuing programme for divestment of stakes in state-owned enterprises, but it drags on it's a very slow process, mainly because there are too many stakeholders with vested interests in making sure they continue to enjoy their privileges that they get through running and managing state-owned businesses. And as I've mentioned, the need for particularly domestic firms to really increase their productivity and to develop to a standard that they can actually become part of the global supply chain. So there's a lot of talk within the government and addressing the foreign business community that they want to see a stronger link between foreign invested businesses and local businesses to enable local businesses to get up to the standards that they need to be to get into the global supply chain. So, well, it's called, I don't know who put mitigating risks on there, but certainly the corruption, regulatory compliance, and a lot of employee fraud and crime is really what you need to be focused on if you're setting up or buying into a Vietnamese businesses. I could probably talk for a whole afternoon about instances I know of employee fraud and white-collar crime in Vietnam. Got a lot of friends and clients that have been totally defrauded in some of the most creative ways that I've seen. So that can be a challenge. So we've got some pretty big agreements that are about to come into effect. Hopefully, the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, which will be a big boost to Vietnamese European trade, tariff eliminations, and also opening up some restricted sectors. I've listed a few of those there, but agriculture, and also pharmaceuticals are the big ones, plus logistics. Some of the services that are covered by the Free Trade Agreement: higher education, financial services, and, as I say, distribution. Vietnam signed up to the Comprehensive Partnership, Trans-Pacific Partnership, Agreement. And although we have signed up to it, it's come into effect, but because we don't have some of the administrative systems in place, we're unable to actually benefit fully from that membership at the moment. But again, it's the commentators say that Vietnam will certainly be the biggest, or one of the biggest beneficiaries of the CPTPP. So that's increased, I think, again, a movement of manufacturing out of China into Vietnam, and also encouraging people from those member countries to also look at manufacturing in Vietnam to lower labour costs. So CPTPP, unlike many of the other trade agreements, they do have quite a lot of requirements for administrative reform, and I think this is where Vietnam is lagging 2 or 3 years behind that schedule. So some of the benefits we will not get immediately or up front, and that's very much the same case as the AEC, the ASEAN Economic Community. We've signed up to it, and I think this is one of the least talked about agreements within ASEAN. Don't hear a lot about it. We don't see people promoting the benefits of it. I know Bruno's here, so we're meant to have a free flow of skilled labour within the tourism, for tourism professionals. Vietnam does not develop the single window, it's not developed the standards for criteria for those people in the industry, and therefore we're just not able to take advantage of that. And to conclude, if you want to become an overseas member, we offer very attractive rates, £430 for corporates and £145 for individuals. And Greg told me to put that on there. So I'm happy to take any questions. Hopefully that was just a high-level snapshot of what's going on. And if you've got specific questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Bruno Vogel from Olympic. Maybe quick, thank you. Quicker question on the
It's not an ice cream chain, by the way. They do have
ice cream too. A quicker question on the real estate. If you look up and down the coast of Vietnam, you have thousands of condos, and in Hanoi and Saigon, condos and buildings growing up on the residential side and the office side. What do you think is happening in about 3 years from now in the residential and real estate market in Vietnam?
Yeah, well, okay, so condotels are a big cause of concern, because what's happened in Vietnam, local developers have been unable to get finance from banks, and they're doing developments, integrated developments, hotel, villas and apartments. So they build condotels and they pre-sell the units, and they pre-sell the villas, which means they can finance their hotel. The problem with condotels, there are no regulations governing condotels in Vietnam at the moment. So if they were to be classified as real estate projects, then the people that have bought those condotels, apartments, would be able to get the proper title deed to own them. If they're classified as tourism projects, and most of them are on tourism developments, then they can only get long lease, they cannot get the title deeds, and they have to go into a rental pool. So that's the dilemma facing the government at the moment. I'm also Vice Chairman of the Tourism Advisory Board in Vietnam, and we just submitted a paper to the Prime Minister urging them to take urgent action on promulgating regulations on condotels, and recommending that although they're certainly part of the tourism inventory for rooms and accommodation, that they be classified as real estate in terms of ownership. In terms of residential development going on in Vietnam, there's huge developments, and you know, people started putting developments of 12,000 apartment units at one end of the street and putting another 11,000 at the other end of the street in Ho Chi Minh City. Massive developments. By and large, the take-up, the selling of them, again, pre-sales, is fairly strong. What we're starting to see at the moment, though, is higher-end foreign investors buying land plots within a licensed project, and prices that some people are asking now, like over $10,000 a square metre in Ho Chi Minh City in District 1, which is 4 times what you pay for another equally good development about a kilometre away. You know, so it's the risk to me is this higher end Vietnamese, that $60 billion that I referred to earlier, is coming out from under people's beds, and they're investing in these really high-end priced units, because the quality will not reflect the price that people are saying. That I can guarantee you. Whether or not there's going to be a bit of a bubble, I don't know. A few months ago I would have said probably. Today, because Ho Chi Minh City has actually suspended about 180 projects, and they banned all new licenses in District 1 and District 3 in Ho Chi Minh City, and in all the other districts, new developments have got to be on a highway or close to a future metro station. So that's certainly taken the heat out of the market in Ho Chi Minh City. So I think, you know, if you look at the middle class statistics, potentially there is enough, there'll be enough people in that middle class to take up that supply coming onto the market. I'm more concerned about hotel developments in, well, particularly Cam Ranh, where you were, Bruno, 17,500 keys coming onto an already fairly saturated market with an airport that's operating at well over design capacity. So that's going to be a challenge, and that's true of several other resort areas in Vietnam. For Quoc, Da Nang's still got a bit of room to grow in terms of airlift, but Ho Chi Minh is design capacity 25 million, and it accommodated 38 million passengers last year.
Last year, the government announced 100% ownership in several sectors or some sectors. Can you elaborate what has happened since then, and specifically in relation to the financial services, where it is still restricted to about 30%?
Yeah, so banks are restricted to 30% and 20% to any individual or corporate buyer or holder of shares. There is relaxation under the new agreements that I've mentioned certainly for securities companies. Other sectors where they were historically restricted, like listed companies, were restricted at 49% foreign ownership. It's now left to the individual companies to decide what their foreign ownership cap will be. Several of them have already gone to 100%. It's not to say necessarily that they're going to have 100% foreign ownership, but they're able to. There's no cap on the foreign ownership, so it's then a market function. State-owned enterprises, of course, are a different thing, and there's still a lot of industries or sectors that are sensitive to the Communist Party. But I think that's starting to change. We're now seeing licensed casinos that are able to allow locals to actually come in and gamble. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but in the context of the Communist Party, that's a very significant change. So Vietnam wants to be part of the global economy. And eventually, I think they'll get there. There's one there and one at the back.
Is there any regulatory special rules and regulations on franchisees and franchise law in Vietnam? Is the rights of the franchisor, are they protected under Vietnam laws?
Right. So intellectual property and franchises can be registered and protected under Vietnam law. Doesn't mean to say somebody's not going to copy you or have a very similar name, but if you can actually show that you are losing money because of infringement of property, intellectual property or copyright, the authorities will take action against those that are infringing. Got a lot of foreign franchises now in Vietnam. I suppose the biggest one is Starbucks. But what I hear on the grapevine is that none of the foreign franchises are yet making any real money in Vietnam. But there's lots of companies beating a path to Vietnam to basically sell franchises. There was a question at the back, I think.
Thank you. Can you give us some insight into education and training in Vietnam right now?
Yeah, I'll try. I'm not an education specialist, but so there's tremendous interest by local. Well, sorry, let's start again. You've got the demand from expat families to have their kids educated locally, and there are several good international schools that cater to that. There's an ever-increasing demand from local Vietnamese families to have their children educated in international schools. And there's recently been a change which allows international schools to take up to 50% of their intake from local students, whereas previously it was restricted to 10%. There's a huge growth in preschool, kindergartens and early learning centres, and by what they're charging, because I've got a young kid at one of those, is phenomenal. They must be making money hand over fist, that's all I can say. $9,000 for 5 mornings a week, that's pretty good going in my book, but anyway. So I'd say, and then we've got university education, where we do have a British university in Vietnam that's starting to expand its courses, and there is quite a good uptake in students for BUV. Is that somebody flashing? So I think certainly the people that are invested in education in Vietnam are very, very positive and making, I think, very good returns, and that growth will continue as the demographics move. So very young population, growing middle class. Culturally, people want to keep their kids close to home and not send them overseas, particularly for secondary education. And I think you'll see that moving through the university education as well, because to a lot of families the cost of overseas university education is prohibitive. The cost of something like British University or RMIT in Ho Chi Minh City is a lot more affordable to local families.
What about vocational?
So vocational, not an awful lot of it at the moment, but a big need for it. So one of the problems that particularly foreign investors have as an employer is workplace readiness for students and anybody, even people moving from established Vietnamese businesses. So this is something the government is also trying to encourage at the moment. They recognise that a lot of industries or sectors you don't need necessarily graduates, but you need people that are workplace ready. Yeah, sorry, I think the gentleman at the back, and then I'll come back to you.
Hi, I've got a question regarding, as a foreigner, either a foreign individual or entity, like setting up an SME in Vietnam, what are some of the regulations, like let's say in terms of minimum capitalization, like how much money do you have to bring into the country to start a business, and also are there any restrictions in terms of minimum number of local employees per foreigner hired, like there are in Thailand, where it's like 4 to 1?
No. Okay, so there are no specific rules on minimum capitalisation. So what the authorities tend to do is they look at the amount of your total investment that you forecast in your business plan that you have to submit as part of the application process, and say 30% of that should be in the form of capital. The rest can be in the form of loans or shareholder loans. If you were operating through a representative office, which is getting harder to establish, there is a maximum of 4 expats, and that tends to be staged as the business developed. But otherwise, there are no specific ratios for expats to locals. But we have to get work permits. Legal representative is allowed to be there without the work permit, but other expats need work permits. and that's where they tend to regulate the number.
Can you please share us on the power project in Vietnam? Because I understand that from the government they broke up last year, and there is some kind of window period up to June. Would you see for the foreign investor going to invest in that kind of sector?
So those incentives are specifically for solar power investment, and I think the incentive's been extended to December. So we've seen a lot of interest in. So as normal in Vietnam, the locals go out and get the licenses. They don't have any money, but they see an opportunity to sell the licenses, and unsuspecting foreigners come along and pay them a lot of money to do that. Or to get those licenses. So those incentives are there. It's created a lot of interest. There's, I think we've been involved with 7 or 8 solar power transactions as Grant Thornton in the last several months. But if you talk to lawyers, then the quality of the power purchase agreements are not really that great. They can be terminated on one year's notice, for example. So you might have a 20-year power purchase agreement with EVN, but there's no guarantee that that's going to last for 20 years. So I think buyer beware and read the small print.
Any more? Right. Ken, thank you so much. Stay there. Stay there. Don't move. Tell I used to be a teacher, go and settle on. I think the one thing that I would have liked to have seen, and this is not a criticism in any way, I would have liked to have seen half a screen Vietnam and half a screen Thailand, because I'd love to know how Thailand compares in terms of the way it's going, the direction it's going, the achievements that it's achieving or not achieving, compared with a neighbouring partner who's also a competitor. And it would be great to see that sort of information, and maybe somehow we can put that together in some way. Maybe Grant Thornton in Thailand. What an idea. Ken, thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to present you with this pen.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks ever so much. Good to have you. We're going to stand in front of you now and watch us have our photographs
Very
taken.
good photograph.
Yeah. Sure. Thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. Thanks to the hotel for the food. I hope you enjoyed your pork chop. It was a big one.